So when April asked me if I would give a talk about Alice on stage in Philadelphia, I said, well, I don't know if there's anything to say. But I think it turned out that there was. So we're gonna take a little journey together. And we're going to start on the 23rd of April, 1869, when a review of a children's book recently published by the Boston firm of Lee and Shepard appeared in the Evening Telegraph here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And it said, "The writer of fairy stories must have a fairy's gift, or his work will quickly fall into disrepute in the nursery, and will be allowed no resting place in the juvenile library. Such will not, we opine, be the fate of the beautiful work before us. Alice's adventures are sufficiently wonderful to excite the admiration of the most unimaginative juvenile that ever stole an hour from his school books for the sake of more attractive literature. And Mr. Tenniel's comical pictures so aptly illustrate the extraordinary narrative that they must be seen to be appreciated, as no description of ours can do them justice. We would be doing no service to the young readers of this book by giving them an idea beforehand of the remarkable things contained in its pages, and we can only commend it as one of the most attractive works of this kind that has come under our notice for a long time. It is printed in large type on thick tinted paper and is richly bound in green Morocco cloth." Now, I have no doubt if Selwyn Goodacre were here, he would point out that the 1869 Lee and Shepard edition of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was also available in orange cloth and maroon cloth and probably other colored cloths that I don't know about. But this review, which was followed in the paper by one for the second part of a book called Little Women, seems to mark the entrance of Alice into the city of Philadelphia. I will attempt in this talk to sketch some of her adventures in that city, and particularly on the stages of her theaters. It seems to me there are two types of talks: those where the speaker has something to say and looks for a nice place to say it, and those where someone, in this case April, invites the speaker to opine on a topic and he must, to the best of his ability, come up with something interesting to say. That this is the latter should in no way absolve me of my responsibility, but when invited to speak on the topic, I entered the project with some trepidation. Would there be anything to say about Alice in the theaters of Philadelphia, and would there be pictures and conversations? Happily, I discovered both, and they came so thick and fast that I have limited myself, with one exception, to the period from Philadelphia's founding on October 27th, 1682, until the release of Walt Disney's Alice in Motion Picture in 1951. Along the way, we will learn something about some of Philadelphia's leading citizens, her institutions, her architecture, and we'll even take some excursions into radio, television, and motion pictures. Now, luckily, the first 2 centuries can be dispensed with fairly quickly. Not surprisingly, there were no stage productions of Alice in Wonderland prior to Philadelphia's bicentenary. But eventually, Alice did find a place in a city that was founded by William Penn, like Lewis Carroll, a Christ Church man. In fact, Penn and Dodgson's portraits used to hang on the same wall in the Great Hall of Christ Church. Yeah, I think it's great. Like, they kicked him out after a year, but he still got his portrait in the Great Hall. On Saturday, March 26, 1892, while Lewis Carroll was still very much alive, Alice may have first set foot on the stages of Pennsylvania. I can certainly trace no earlier Pennsylvania theatrical Alice. When the class of 1894 of Wilson College in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, presented to a large audience an entertainment consisting of Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass in the college chapel in Thompson Hall. The program was rendered in a happy manner, which won for the ladies much applause. Miss Etta Criswell took the part of Alice. Founded in 1869, the year the review of Alice appeared in the Philadelphia Evening Telegraph by 2 Presbyterian ministers and affiliated with the Presbyterian Church, Wilson was one of the first colleges in the United States to accept only female students, and the cast of Alice was composed entirely of women. The following year, the Sabbath school of, and you forgive my faulty pronunciation here, of Shaorai Shomayim congregation in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which I was interested to find was one of the oldest Jewish communities in North America, presented a beautiful cantata entitled Alice in Wonderland in Martin's Hall. The hall was filled with a most intelligent audience who applauded the work of the children, this time both boys and girls, including Helen Rosenstein as Alice. The composer of this beautiful cantata was unnamed in press reports, but by 1893, both the Presbyterian and Jewish populations of Pennsylvania had embraced Alice. More importantly, Alice was creeping closer to Philadelphia, from 160 miles away in Chambersburg to a mere 70 miles distant in Lancaster. but she would make at least one more stop before arriving at the city of brotherly love. When the Parsons School of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania held their second annual graduation exercises at the Odd Fellows Hall in June 1894, the gem of the evening, according to the Wilkes-Barre Times, was Alice in Wonderland, performed by the pupils of Miss Cox's school. The unique and ludicrous costumes and characters were most amusing. Alice in Wonderland was well sustained by Miss Josie Walsh, who could be distinctly heard through the crowded hall. The song and dance of the turtle and griffin were most comical, causing roars of laughter. In May 1899, Alice finally arrived officially in Philadelphia. Like so much theater in Philadelphia over the years, she came from New York. Now, granted, just as often theater is on the way to New York when it plays in Philadelphia, but in 1899 at the Broad Street Theater and the Chestnut Street Opera House, the production of Alice was on the way from New York to Baltimore when it stopped here for several days of performances at the two theaters. The script of the production was by W. de Wagstaff, and the costumes supposedly based on designs by Tenniel. The Philadelphia Inquirer welcomed Alice to the city with these words: "The only interesting feature of the entire performance is the work of a child whom the management wished to be known as Little Ruby. This child, taking the part of Alice, has a remarkable memory. Only occasionally, when something went wrong, did she need prompting. And by the movement of her lips, one could see that she followed the parts of the others closely and would herself prompt some of the adults. There is a senseless lot of talk through without wit or pathos. Human beings dressed up as a frog, a rabbit, a turtle, a mouse, and a hare amused the children in the audience and wearied the adults. The scene in the second act showing the Mad Tea Party had a little merit, which was appreciated amidst such a dearth of good things." So apparently the best thing about this show was a child star who annoyingly mouthed everybody else's lines to them. Having worked with children before, I can tell you that's the first thing you tell them not to do. Now, the Times of Philadelphia, writing of the same performance, was a good deal kinder and therefore produced a review that's a lot less fun to read. But suffice it to say that they also admired Little Ruby, calling her a marvel, a most wonderful little actress and dancer, and called the production very prettily presented and executed and a pleasing piece for children to see, though the reviewer admitted that the audience was mostly adults. The play had come to Philadelphia from the Carnegie Lyceum in New York, a venue we now know as Carnegie Hall, where it enjoyed a run during April 1899, though enjoyed may be pushing the point. The New York World wrote that it was portrayed with indifferent success, and that the enthusiastic child audience, quote, couldn't understand it as it was played, neither could anyone else. The Tribune subhead read, "A clever Alice and some unaccountable mistakes," and noted that the play did not add much to the mental stores of those who have for so many years held Lewis Carroll's book in an affection amounting almost to reverence. "Probably the best way to present Alice," the reviewer wrote, "is to have it acted by children and contrived and managed by grown people. The performances of last week were acted by grown people and seem to have been contrived and managed by children." Now, it's interesting, when it was produced by Saville Clark on the stage at the Prince of Wales Theatre in 1886, it was mostly acted by children and contrived and managed by adults. Complaining of the unplaying card-like costumes of the King and Queen of Hearts, the reviewer wrote, "Clearly Lewis Carroll meant that these characters were the actual cards, and in Tenniel's illustrations, the King and Queen looked like the King and Queen of Hearts on the cards. In the play, they might as well have been the King and Queen of Chickaraboo for all their costumes showed." I had to get that in there. I think I now am officially the first person to ever utter the word Chickaraboo at a Lewis Carroll Society meeting. Little Ruby as Alice came in for praise, however, and was called the only one who is perfect in her own part and ready to help the rest. So who exactly was this Little Ruby who first enacted Alice on the stages of Philadelphia? She was, in fact, the nearly 9-year-old daughter of Mrs. K.A. Johnson and her Scottish husband of 357 West 23rd Street, New York, or, according to the newspaper in Hartford, Connecticut, of Hartford, Connecticut. In 1894, when she visited England at the age of 3 years and 7 months, she was called an infant phenomenon. Billed as a child dancer, she gave a command performance at Marlborough House in front of the Prince and Princess of Wales, the future King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. One journalist pronounced, Precocity like hers is all very well for the amusement of sisters and cousins and aunts and uncles and fond mothers and proud fathers in the drawing room. But the stage can get along without it, and in the interests of the little ones themselves, it should certainly try. See the forthcoming book of pamphlets for Lewis Carroll's opinions on that subject. Nonetheless, the child prodigy of a dancer by 1897 was acting in the play Tom Pinch in the company of the English actor E.S. Willard when he was on tour in Philadelphia. Willard, I'm sure you will recall, originated the role of the villainous Captain Skinner in Henry Arthur Jones's play The Silver King, which Charles Dodgson saw several times in its original production. Thus, although Dodgson may never have seen little Ruby herself on stage, he was only 1 degree of separation from her. Alice in Wonderland may have been little Ruby's last hurrah. By 1903, she was described in Everybody's Magazine as well remembered as a charming baby dancer. She was by then, of course, 12 years old, and you know what show business is like for middle-aged women. In 1901, we find a brief mention of a suburban Alice when a number of the younger set presented Alice in Wonderland in Wayne, Pennsylvania. And then on January 14th, 1906, readers of the Philadelphia Inquirer needed to venture no farther than their own living rooms to enjoy a play of Alice in Wonderland. That Sunday's edition of the Inquirer included absolutely free a complete toy theater, all ready to cut out and set up with proscenium arch, footlights, wings, and stage. Everything complete, including the actors in costume. I'm curious how they got actors into the newspaper, but you know. The play featured was Alice in Wonderland. And in advertising this theater, the paper claimed, and so it must be true, this is the greatest and best children's novelty that has ever been produced. Another ad claimed that this toy was just like a real theater. And you can see from this illustration in the advertisement that it absolutely was. The entire edition of that Sunday's Inquirer was sold out early in the day, so another toy theater was planned for the following week, this one depicting, of course, Robinson Crusoe. Clearly, the Lovett family held some sway in Philadelphia in 1906. On the February 23rd, 1907, Philadelphians woke up to this intriguing headline: "Interesting portrayal of Lewis Carroll's ludicrous characters given by clever women." Now, I leave it to you to judge whether it might have been more fun to see an interesting portrayal of Lewis Carroll's clever characters portrayed by ludicrous women. But nonetheless, the performance was given by the members of the Plastic Club, one of the oldest arts clubs in the United States, founded in Philadelphia in 1897, and limiting its membership to women, virtually all of them clever, until 1991. The Inquirer reported that the scene of the Mad Tea Party was particularly effective, and the dance of the Mock Turtle and the Griffin was very cleverly executed. The cast included Mathilde Weil, an editor and literary agent who was also known, like Lewis Carroll, for her portrait photography. She took the role of the Duchess, and Eleanor Plaisted Abbott, a distinguished book illustrator, scenic designer, and painter, played the role of the king. Abbott illustrated such classics as Treasure Island, Cinderella, and the aforementioned Robinson Crusoe. She also illustrated a couple of books called Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. Byron Sewell's Much of a Muchness gives the date of the first appearance of Abbott's Alice illustrations as 1912, 5 years after her performance as the king in the play. One wonders if that play was a positive experience for Mrs. Abbott. For some reason, she did not draw an illustration of the king. So as soon as I heard about this, I thought, oh, who published the editions of the Alice books that were illustrated by Eleanor Plaisted Abbott? I ran to my shelf and I said, please, please, let it be Henry Altimus, that famous Philadelphia house that turned out one edition after another. But such was not to be. It was, in fact, George W. Jacobs and Company of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In 1910, the people of Philadelphia and its suburbs turned their Carrollian attention to those less fortunate, and a production of Alice in Wonderland was staged as a charity benefit. It's worth noting that when Charles Dodgson was applied to for his sanction for presenting Alice on stage to raise money for St. Thomas's schools in Oxford, he replied, "Long ago I made up my mind that I do not approve of that mode of getting money for charitable objects." But with Dodgson dead and buried, there was no stopping Philadelphia. On May 21st, 1910, Mrs. Henry Edward Drayton sponsored an Alice entertainment at her estate, The Cedars, in Penland. A chorus of young ladies trained by Mrs. Drayton participated, and the affair was a great success, raising money for Holiday House, a pleasant place where young women who have not sufficient means to take a vacation may refresh themselves in the country. A descendant of this charity, still calling itself Holiday House, may be found today at Cape Ann, New Jersey. I was never able to find out if Holiday House was named after the Victorian novel that Lewis Carroll famously gave a copy of to the Little Sisters, but wouldn't that be nice if it turned out to be the case? Less than 3 weeks later, on June 7th, 1910, the Philadelphia branch of the International Kindergarten Union gave a performance of Alice in Wonderland on the lawn of the Pennsylvania Institution for the Instruction of the Blind. The play was staged and directed by Julia Neely and featured Marion Duffield as Alice. Whether the production was a benefit for the Institution for the Instruction of the Blind or merely hosted by them is unclear, but some of the children there clearly benefited from Alice's being played on the lawn, as the following story illustrates. More than 30 little girls, eager, interested, but sightless, sat on the green lawn at the Pennsylvania School for the Blind and watched a performance of Alice in Wonderland. For an hour preceding the play, these little blind girls caused the kindergarten teachers and guests to sit in wide-eyed astonishment as they rehearsed their dances, which will be a feature of the festival to be held next Saturday. As they circled around the maypole in intricate figures and performed other complicated drills, there was never a slip or a mishap. A few minutes before the performance began, 2 children approached their teacher and asked in all seriousness if they might watch the play. The teacher acquiesced, and soon they were all gathered on the grass facing the stage. The story was presented with rare beauty and attention to detail. The background of flowers, together with the concrete wall of the main building, was in pictorial harmony with the costumes, actions, and speech of the players. Though deprived of the power to appreciate any but the last of these pleasure-giving elements in the performances, the little listeners' faces lighted up as they caught the humor in the lines of the play. It was apparent by their attention to the dialogue that the sightless part of the audience followed closely the actions of the play. Their faces told that the minds of the blind children were filled with pictures. Certain it was that many a tear was silently wiped away from the eyes of those who witnessed this spectacle. 4 years later, on Saturday, February 21st, 1914, an entertainment was presented by and for children at the Playroom of Plays and Players on 43 South 18th Street. Since the program was for children, no one under the age of 15 was admitted, so there are no reviews in the local paper. The cast list was published, however, and alongside Alice B. Haskell as Alice in Wonderland, we find youngsters playing Mowgli, Cinderella, William Tell, Scheherazade, and Santa Claus. Clearly, this was not a traditional retelling of the Alice story. On April 9th, 1922, Alice was enacted by the members of the Fellowship of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in a lecture room of the Academy to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Fellowship. Among the actors was John Frederick Lewis, president of the Academy and a prominent Philadelphia lawyer, philanthropist, and this is the most important part, book collector. So, in other words, one of us. Portraits of famous Americans collected and donated by Lewis hang in many Philadelphia institutions, and he donated his collection of more than 2,800 cuneiform tablets to the rare book department of the Free Library of Philadelphia. Now, let's talk about Margaret Scott Oliver for a minute. Margaret was born in Scotland and came to the United States when she was 3 years old. The 1920s found her living with her family in Philadelphia and working as an actress and playwright with the Rose Valley Players and then with the Hedgerow Theater, a repertory theater established in a former mill in Rose Valley, Pennsylvania, by New York actor Jasper Dieter, and now the oldest repertory theater in the United States. Margaret wrote a script for a production of Alice in Wonderland, which was presented by Hedgerow Theater for 6 years, and beginning in 1926, the production was mounted annually in Philadelphia, often at the Broad Theater, either as part of a summer stock series or at Christmas time. The lead role for 6 years running was taken by Margaret's daughter Peggy, who was born in 1912 and would have been 18 by the time of the 1930 production. Now, this is all well and good, but here comes the fun part. Guess where the Olivers once lived? At the time that Peggy Oliver, the future Alice in Wonderland, was born, Margaret and her family lived in the guest house in the utopian community of Rose Valley, the village which includes the Thunderbird Lodge and the Hedgerow Theater. The guest house was one of the first structures in Rose Valley renovated by the great arts and crafts architect William Price, who renovated or built many buildings in Rose Valley. The guest house consisted of 3 units. The Olivers lived in the middle, and their next-door neighbors were none other than Eleanor Plaisted Abbott and her family. Remember her? This means the Olivers and the Abbotts lived next door to each other at the very time that Eleanor Plaisted Abbott's illustrations of Alice were first being published. Was it just a coincidence that the mother next door to Eleanor later decided to adapt Alice for her daughter, who had been a newborn when those illustrations appeared? Probably so, but it's still pretty cool. Margaret Scott Oliver's script covered both Alice and Looking Glass in a prologue, 9 scenes, and an epilogue. And the director, Jasper Dieter, according to one reviewer, captured the youthful viewpoint of this childhood classic. All of the imagery and humor of the book was retained. In April 1924, the Junior League of Philadelphia presented a production of Alice in Wonderland, mounted entirely by League members and in some cases their families. As the paper pointed out, and I'm not sure why you'd be so proud about saying this, no professionals have been engaged, even the members of the orchestra being of the League. Among the performers was Mr. James Fonstock, treasurer of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and a man described as one who saw the Battle of Gettysburg as a little boy and was among the dwindling few in Philadelphia who would not on Sunday discard his silk hat. We can only hope that Mr. Fonstock, stubborn sporter of his silk hat, was cast in the role of the Hatter. One hopes, too, that he enjoyed the chance to perform in Alice, for he didn't have a chance to do much else. He died on June 7th, 1924, in Philadelphia, just 6 weeks after the Junior League Alice. The Junior League was made up entirely of women, though they did allow a few men into their cast. Not so the Service Club of the Philadelphia High School for Girls, who presented Alice in March 1925. With a cast of famous and photogenic characters from the Hatter to the Mock Turtle to Alice herself, the Inquirer chose to run a photograph of a courtier and a court attendant, though the reader remained unenlightened as to the difference between a courtier and a court attendant. Nonetheless, who would not look at this photograph and instantly cry, Alice in Wonderland? There is at least a wonderful irony here, as the Queen of Hearts in the upper left corner is portrayed as a head without a body. No doubt the Cheshire Cat would approve. On May 3rd, 1926, at the Metropolitan Opera House in Philadelphia, the ballet of the Philadelphia Civic Opera Company staged a special ballet production in which over 400 dancers participated. Along with the complete version of the ballet Faust, audiences were treated to ballets from Carmen, Samson and Delilah, and a modern version of Alice in Wonderland, which was presented in pantomime with more than 150 children impersonating the characters of this famous fairy story. Today, Alice is well established as a ballet piece, but in 1926, Alice ballets were still rare, and this was probably the first one to be staged in Philadelphia. 2 other productions of the 1920s bear mentioning, if only because I am, however modestly, able to illustrate them. The first was a production presented by the Philadelphia Arts Alliance in December 1928 at the Garrick Theater. Aside from this photograph of what appears to be rather two-dimensional characters, little is known, by me at least, of this Alice. And rounding out the 1920s was the November 30th, 1929 performance staged at the Penn Athletic Club by the Junior Forum and under the auspices of its founder, arts patron Margaret Wynne Paris. Alice was the first of 10 planned juvenile entertainments by the Junior Forum. This short-lived organization presented intelligent addresses, valuable debates, and fine plays, many by boys and girls. Taking the title role in the 1929 Alice production was an aspiring Philadelphia actress, 12-year-old Eleanor Bloom. Eleanor would learn the difficulties of the acting business when she went on to work at the Hedgerow Theater. Remember the Hedgerow Theater? Where she said, "oh," in several productions. In other plays, she was allowed to say yes, which was considered a promotion. I see the actors in the audience nodding very curiously. At 19, Bloom gave up the theater to attend her father's alma mater, the University of Wisconsin. And she said of acting, "If you want to play roles requiring depth and understanding, the things learned from books and professors will help give you those qualities," said Bloom. So that's good to know since we're on a university campus, which I'm guessing still has books and professors. We still have those things? Yeah, okay. Which all brings us to Claire Tree Major, the founder and director of the Children's Theater of New York, who was the first producer in America to provide professional touring plays exclusively for children's audiences, which she did from 1925 to 1954. She believed that children's theater should be educational and teach socially acceptable behavior, though it's unclear exactly what behavior she expected Alice in Wonderland to teach. Talking back to your elders, perhaps. She wrote the plays herself, almost always basing them on pre-existing stories well known to children. My two requirements in selecting plays, wrote Major, are do the children know them, and are they in themselves good plays? Early in her career, Major gave out cards to 10,000 children, asking them to suggest subjects for plays. Later, she would poll the groups who sponsored her company's tour as to what plays they most wanted to see. Major produced seasons of 6 touring plays and liked to have a 5-year hiatus between productions of a play. Thus, Alice in Wonderland was on her schedule in 1935 and again in 1940. All told, Major produced Alice 5 times, beginning in 1931. Her Alice in Wonderland was presented in Philadelphia 4 times, sponsored by the Children's Theater of Philadelphia, which had been founded in 1930. Hosting these productions took no little planning, as we can see from this photograph of members of the Committee for the Children's Theater at a working tea in November 1935. One of them looks like she's working on a production of Peter Pan with that hat, but in the 1935 production, the role of Alice was played by Jewel Morse, who had previously appeared as a chorus girl on Broadway in Strike Me Pink with Jimmy Durante and in George White's music hall varieties with Bert Lahr and Harry Richmond. Harry Richmond, you will no doubt recall, was the actor who sang the song Alice in Wonderland in the 1930 film Puttin' on the Ritz. Later in the 1935 tour of the Clare Tree Major Company, Alice was played by Dorothy Major, daughter of the producer. I'm detecting a pattern here. If you want to get a part as Alice, make sure your mom is the producer. One mother described Major's 1948 production of Alice thus: excellently done, very easily understood, costuming and scenery beautiful, looked as if the characters had stepped from the book. It far exceeded any previous production I had been to and I have been to the Clare Tree Major plays for several years. In 1947, the Children's Theater of Philadelphia sponsored another performance of Alice in Wonderland, but Alice was not in Clare Tree Major's rotation that year, and so this Alice at the Bellevue Stratford Ballroom was a production of the Philadelphia-based Salome Gaynor Theater for Children, the theater, incidentally, that hired a 17-year-old Bobby Darin in 1953. Sadly, Bobby Darin didn't perform in their production of Alice. That would have been great. So, returning to the early 1930s, the Casonetti Chorus and Littlefield Ballet presented a benefit to more than 1,200 people at the ballroom of the Penn Athletic Club. We're back on campus again. Under the title Alice in Songland, the first third of the program was given over to the adventures of Alice in Wonderland, and the proceeds went to the Philadelphia Home for Incurables, now known as Inglis House, a care home for persons with physical disabilities. 6 days later, on April 25th, Tony Sarg brought his marionette production of Alice to Philadelphia for a performance at the Walnut Street Theater. Sarg, the creator of the original Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade balloons in the 1920s, had produced his marionette Alice in New York a few months earlier. The reviewer for the Philadelphia Inquirer noted, and this is probably my favorite misplaced modifier that I've ever come across, the children in the audience were held wide-eyed and fascinated by the lifelike acting of the dolls, many of them apparently confused in their minds as to whether they were dolls or actual living persons. Now, if that's not a plot for a horror movie, I don't know what is. Another marionette Alice would be presented at the department store Gimbel's on December 24th, 1933. Why not wait until 2:30 on Christmas Eve to do your shopping and then dump the kids at an Alice puppet show? The Haynes Marionettes teamed up with the Junior Cinema Guild in 1935 for a combination puppet show film screening. The Marionettes presented parts from Alice in Wonderland, Barnacle Bill, The Owl and the Pussycat, and circus acts, while the movies included Disney's Babes in the Woods, Mickey Mouse, and Crazy Cat. Not surprisingly, 1932, the centenary of Lewis Carroll's birth, brought a surge of interest in Alice in Wonderland. On May 10th, Alice Hargreaves herself visited Philadelphia to have lunch with A.S.W. Rosenbach, who had bought the original manuscript of Alice's Adventures Underground at auction 4 years earlier. Philadelphia stores advertised a variety of Alice merchandise, and in February, the Philadelphia Orchestra, under the direction of Bernardino Molinari, presented a program paying tribute to Lewis Carroll, and including Deems Taylor's 5-part suite, Through the Looking Glass. Taylor was a composer, critic, radio commentator, and promoter of classical music. In 1940, he would appear in the Walt Disney film Fantasia as the Master of Ceremonies, and he will come back into our story, so remember his name. On March 19th, the Junior Cinema Guild presented a production of Alice in Wonderland at the Penn Athletic Club again, although judging from this picture, it might better have been called Alice in Zombieland. And yes, that is an advertisement for Robinson Crusoe, you see right below the Alice ad. On April 23rd, the Philadelphia High School Girls Reserve of the Young Women's Christian Association, or PHSGRYWCA, as I'm sure the t-shirt said, gave a modern version of Alice in Wonderland at their annual banquet. What exactly was modern about the performance is, alas, lost to history. The role of Alice was played by Dixie Sterling. I couldn't find out much about Dixie, but she did go to William and Mary. And in March of 1935, and I think you all agree this is incredibly relevant, she attended a physical education conference at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So if anybody, if anybody had Dixie Sterling as a gym teacher, please see me afterwards. December 1932 saw a different sort of appearance of Alice on stage in Philadelphia when Charles Dodgson's nephew, Bertram J. Collingwood, came to the city to discuss his uncle and his famous book as part of his lecture tour in the United States. All proceeds went to the establishment of Lewis Carroll cots at hospitals in London and New York. Collingwood spent several weeks in the U.S. lecturing and giving interviews to local newspapers. Many of these interviews have never been transcribed or reprinted, and while they do not add shocking new material to the store of knowledge about Dodgson, they're well worth reading, as few family members who knew him well in life published memoirs of Dodgson. Of course, the biggest 1932 Alice show in Philadelphia did not arrive until November 1933. That was the Alice play staged by Ava Le Gallienne at her Civic Repertory Theater in New York, which later moved uptown for a Broadway run and then toured the country, returning for more performances on the road late in 1933. Le Gallienne's Alice, with Ava herself as the White Queen and Josephine Hutchison as Alice, ran for a week at the Chestnut Street Opera House in late November 1933 and set a Philadelphia box office record of $29,000 for 9 performances, a record which would stand until Katharine Hepburn came to town 6 years later in 1939 in a play called The Philadelphia Story, which hardly seems fair. Le Gallienne's Alice has been well documented and is probably better known to most Carrollians than any other production I will mention this morning. So I will let you enjoy the illustration here by Pennsylvania artist Charles Bell that appeared in the Inquirer the day before the show opened, and we shall move on. If you'd like to see piles of photographs and playbills from the 1932 production, just stop by the house anytime. The Junior Cinema Guild were at it again in March 1935 when they teamed up with the Junior League to present another combination program featuring a ballet of Alice accompanied by films like Disney's The Grasshopper and the Ant and more Mickey Mouse. The Alice Ballet was directed by Ethel and Edward Phillips and featured, amazingly, the entire story of Alice in 3 scenes. The dances included not only Ballet of the Flowers and Dance of Tweedledum and Tweedledee, but also the Dance of the Dwarves, possibly a first for an Alice ballet. Now, in 1936, if you were a Philadelphia Eagles fan, and yes, you could be a Philadelphia Eagles fan in 1936 because the team was established in 1933, taking, and I just had to work this in, even though it has nothing to do with Lewis Carroll, taking their mascot from the emblem for Roosevelt's National Recovery Act. It's got to be the only professional sports team that's named after a piece of legislation, you know. Although I do think No Child Left Behind would be a great name for like a football team. So anyhow, if you were an Eagles fan in 1936, you had 2 choices when it came to listening to Alice on your radio in Philadelphia. On April 27th, you could listen on KYW or WEAF radio as Lionel Barrymore read excerpts from Alice in Wonderland. Lionel Barrymore. You probably know him as Mr. Potter from It's a Wonderful Life. And doubtless the highlight of the evening must have been when Alice stole $8,000 from the Knave of Hearts. On December 23rd, an Alice in Wonderland radio operetta was broadcast over WFIL and WJZ. Since Alice is a story for children, the operetta was conveniently scheduled to air at 10:30 p.m. The reason I included this operetta, although it originated from the NBC radio network and was not a Philadelphia production, is because of the astounding fact that the music was written by Meredith Wilson, more than 20 years before his 1957 Tony Award-winning Best Musical, The Music Man. The songs included not just You Were Old Father William and Beautiful Soup, but also Sailing Mouse and The Magic Box. And if anybody has a recording of that, see me after. That would be incredible. For those who preferred an in-person Alice in 1936 of Philadelphia, they could, just days after Lionel Barrymore's broadcast, join a crowd of several thousand people on the Gray Towers campus of Beaver College, now Acadia University, in suburban Philadelphia. to see the students' annual May Day pageant, which featured 200 girls performing Alice in Wonderland. Grey Towers Castle, purchased by the college in 1929, must have made an impressive backdrop for this Alice. March 1938 saw more Alice ballet in Philadelphia as Mary Benny Montgomery dancers joined forces with the Italo-American Philharmonic Orchestra under the baton of Guglielmo Sabatini to present a program that included a premiere of an Alice ballet billed as being by, quote, Forsythe. Presumably this referred to the music of English composer Cecil Forsythe, whose Alice in Wonderland 6 miniatures for orchestra had been composed in 1931. There had been Alice in Wonderland films shown in Philadelphia at least as early as 1915, and most of the early motion picture representations of Alice have been well documented. But 1938 saw the screening in Philadelphia of a film with some interesting Alice content that is not listed, for instance, in David Schaefer's seminal The Film Collector's Alice. My Lucky Star was a vehicle for the ice skating champion turned movie star Sonja Henie. The film opened at the Fox Theater in Philadelphia on September 2nd, 1938, and the film's highlight is Sonja Henie's Alice in Wonderland Alice Ballet, Ice Ballet. Mildred Martin, writing in the Philadelphia Inquirer, said, "The ballet's atmosphere is, in spite of the costuming, more Babes in Toyland than Alice in Wonderland. For music, it depends principally upon Victor Herbert's March of the Toys and I Can't Do That Some, and Sonja is dressed as a French doll instead of the traditional Alice Pinafore. Though she may not be Alice, it doesn't matter once she has skipped through the looking glass and begins skimming over the ice." Both Victor Herbert and Sonja Henie had other Alice involvements. Herbert's musical Wonderland, originally titled Alice and the Eight Princesses, had unfortunately shed its previous Alice content by the time it opened on Broadway in 1905. Henie included a long Alice segment which used some of the same costumes from My Lucky Star in her 1938 Hollywood Ice Review, which toured the country, but which unfortunately didn't seem to stop here in Philadelphia. Discarding the traditional commencement speech-making, wrote the Inquirer on January 20th, 1939, 329 seniors at South Philadelphia Girls High School relied on Alice in Wonderland to enliven their graduation exercises last night. But how exactly Alice in Wonderland enlivened their graduation exercises is lost in the mists of time. In May 1940, the same paper recorded the annual garden fete and exhibit of student artwork, which is to be held at the studio of the Wayne Arts Center. The Alice in Wonderland performance at 3 o'clock will delight the juvenile visitors. The Wayne Arts Center, just outside town, was established in 1930 as the first art center on the Philadelphia Main Line. In its first year, it enrolled 119 children and 17 adults in art classes. Today, it enrolls over 6,000 students and welcomes 30,000 visitors a year. And like so many other Philadelphia institutions, Alice is a part of its history. In December 1940, the Philadelphia Dance Association presented a program at Plays and Players on Delancey Street that included the Mad Tea Party, set to music by Prokofiev, Montpu, and Honegger. The program was danced by Merle Marsicano and her group. Marsicano was an avant-garde dancer and choreographer from Philadelphia who studied both dance with Martha Graham and acting with Sanford Meisner. Following the February 22, 1941 performance of Alice by the Clare Tree Major Company, already mentioned, there would be no Alice productions listed in the Philadelphia papers for the 4 years of American involvement in World War II. Certainly some enterprising graduate student should write a thesis on Alice or the lack of Alice in wartime, but as I am neither enterprising nor a grad student, we'll just press on to 1945. On June 20th, 1945, the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus opened that year's circus in Philadelphia. Now, there was nothing so very remarkable about that, nor did the people of Philadelphia think it so very much out of the way to see the new fireproof tent for the circus being erected on G Street and Erie Avenue. But when the first act closer of the circus was a segment called Alice in Circus Wonderland, Philadelphians rose to their feet, for it flashed across their minds that they had never before seen either a circus act based on Lewis Carroll or a fireproof tent to present it in. Yes, for the 75th anniversary of America's most famous circus, Robert Ringling created and staged an Alice segment, costumed by Billy Livingston, who had credits both on Broadway and Hollywood, and with a ballet directed by the Hollywood choreographer Paul Osgood, whose work I'm sure you'll remember from The Road to Morocco and especially Cobra Woman, and music specially composed for this production by none other than our old friend Deems Taylor. Deems Taylor went to Sarasota, Florida, the winter home of the circus, to rehearse the band, and there the 59-year-old composer met a 20-year-old costumer named Lucille Watson Little, and the two eloped to Arlington, Virginia. The marriage was Taylor's third, and it lasted for 8 years. And he was literally almost 3 times her age. The circus Alice was played by Mason Morgan, and the New York Times called Alice in Circus Wonderland a revelation. The wonders of Alice's Wonderland paraded to a lilting score by Deems Taylor. The venerable Merle Evans and his brass ensemble of 31 gave Alice and her friends a melodic journey. Billboard wrote that the circus moved along to a crescendo that had them rocking in their seats and cheering at the completion of the Alice in Wonderland spectacle that marked the close of the first half. Alice was carried to her circus Wonderland on illuminated water-spouting floats that actually had been renovated. They had been used by the circus some 30 or 40 years earlier and were brought out of the warehouse and renovated just for Alice. And then she was escorted with the Mad Hatter and the White Rabbit by Emmett Kelly, one of America's most renowned circus clowns, and the man who had saved countless lives by his quick action the year before when the Ringling Brothers tent caught fire in Hartford, Connecticut, hence the new fireproof tent. Ava Le Gallienne's 1947 revival of her Alice production was announced as coming to the Philadelphia Shubert Theater for 2 weeks, beginning October 20th, 1947, but no advertisements or reviews of the production appear in the papers, and it seems that the run was canceled. In April 1948, the students of West Philadelphia High School put on a production of Alice. I'm guessing that's the Mad Hatter there on the left. Not to be outdone, the Upper Darby High School Players presented Alice in Wonderland in May of 1950, and their production, or 30 minutes of it anyway, was broadcast at 6 p.m. on May 13th on 3 local television stations. Now, I ask you, when was the last time you saw a good or even a bad high school production of Alice in Wonderland broadcast on your local television station? On October 16th, 1948, the Mae Desmond Children's Theater presented a production of Alice in Wonderland at Town Hall. Mae Desmond, an actress who grew up in South Philadelphia, and with her husband Frank Fielder founded the Mae Desmond Players in 1917, became a leading light of the Philadelphia stage, producing family-friendly theater in the city with her husband for over 50 years. And all of that brings us finally to Wanamakers. Yeah. Has anybody been down to Wanamakers today? It's still there. In 1876, a Philadelphia retailer named John Wanamaker opened one of the first department stores in the United States. And in 1911, the new 12-story Wanamaker store, consisting of over 2 million square feet, was opened by President William Howard Taft. This, incidentally, in the same year that Taft opened and presided over the dedication of the main branch of the New York Public Library, so he was a pretty busy guy. Wanamaker's store included the pipe organ from the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, which is now the largest organ in the world. It's still in the store, which is now a Macy's, and you can go hear it played. I think they play it like every half hour or something throughout the day. I wish I had had time to go over there and listen to it. The store was the first to use price tags, the first department store with electrical illumination, and the first with a telephone. The Crystal Tea Room on the 9th floor was one of the largest dining rooms in the world, capable of serving 1,400 people at once. The store also had 2 auditoria, the Egyptian Hall Auditorium and the Greek Hall Auditorium on the 3rd floor. Wanamakers would mount various performances in these spaces, often including some sort of Easter show. And in March 1950, 16 months before the release of Walt Disney's Alice in Wonderland film, the Special Events Department of Wanamakers presented an Easter ballet of Alice in Wonderland. The production included songs, dances, a 16-piece orchestra, and a cast of 35, headlined by only high school sophomore Rosemary Bangham as Alice. The dancers ranged in age from 9 to 23 and were students of the choreographer Thomas Cannon, who'd been a leading member of the Philadelphia Ballet and one of the first ballet masters in Philadelphia to train African-American dancers. The show ran from March 10th to April 1st, and on March 15th, the 5 p.m. performance was televised live on WFIL-TV Channel 6. Let that sink in for a moment. A leading ballet master and an orchestra of 16 musicians headed up an Alice in Wonderland ballet at a department store that was broadcast live on television. Keep in mind that WFIL was Philadelphia's second oldest television station and yet had been on the air for less than 3 years when it broadcast Wanamaker's Alice Ballet. You might think that would make it the first Alice Ballet television broadcast in Philadelphia history, but you'd be wrong. On May 23rd, 1949, the first anniversary of its first broadcast, WCAU-TV aired an episode of the short-lived CBS series Through the Crystal Ball, a ballet version of Alice in Wonderland. Though not strictly a Philadelphia program, it was advertised in the Inquirer, and since it's an often overlooked small screen Alice, I think it's worth mentioning here. One reviewer wrote of this series, "This is essentially a ballet program, though it departs frequently from classical ballet forms. It tells stories, some old and some new, in dance, and unlike most ballets, it employs occasional songs and even a bit of dialogue, though the talk is held to a minimum. It is the first program I know of that recognizes that a television program can be pretty to look at, and that factor alone can almost sustain a half-hour program," which is what this is. Now, the Alice production was not helped by the fact that one of the cameras blew out during the broadcast. And the reviewer did go on to say, Alice was cut down to its most famous scenes: the entry of the White Rabbit, the scene where Alice is reduced to size 3, the Mad Duchess and her unfortunate baby, who is pitched around like a baseball, the Cheshire Cat, nicely played by Arthur Treacher, bereft for once of his butler's outfit, the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, the Croquet Party, and this is my favorite quote from this review, and a trial scene which was substituted for some reason for the banquet. Well, the reason would be because the banquet's in the other book, and the trial scene is in Alice. But, the individual dancing was excellent. The choreography, I put this in with some hesitance because I'm no means an expert. Yeah, you weren't an expert on Alice in Wonderland either. Was a little muddy and occasionally lacking in imagination. The show was choreographed by Pauline Kohner, who wrote that in television, there are no side wings. You can enter from above, the corners, or beneath. It was a revelation. I put a ladder outside of the camera focus. A dancer jumped from the top and entered from the top of the screen with a magical effect. And it's amazing to see them playing around with this new technology. And yet, I can't think when the last time I saw a television actor enter from the top of the screen was. Kohner recalls the cast including Bambi Lynn, who'd played Alice on Broadway and on tour in 1947 and 48, and of course who had her first Broadway job as in the musical Oklahoma. But the Inquirer clearly advertised Joan McCracken, also made famous by being in the cast of Oklahoma, as the star of the show. The Inquirer, however, was wrong, perish the thought. McCracken had starred in an earlier episode of Through the Crystal Ball called Wild West. At least one other paper ran this mistaken advertisement. One suspects it was sent out by the network or the sponsors, the Ford Motor Company, who mistakenly put the previous week's star in the copy. One other thing worth noting about Through the Crystal Ball, the first episode of this series was a ballet of Robinson Crusoe. I'm not making this stuff up, I promise. So I did promise one production after our 1951 deadline, and I also promised Debbie Allen. So let's quickly skip to 1961 and the distinguished African-American actress, playwright, and director Vinette Carroll, who first tried her hand at staging a musical African-American Alice at her Urban Arts Corps in New York as part of Black Expo in April 1969. She called the show But Never Jam Today, and it featured Marilyn Winbush as Alice and a score by Bert Keys and Bob Larimer. Under that same title, and with the same composer-lyricist team, a rewritten version of the musical with the same actress playing Alice opened on Broadway on July 31st, 1979, but received poor reviews and closed after a few performances. In between those first and third versions of Vinette Carroll's script, however, was a second version titled simply Alice. This version had a completely new score by Mickey Grant. It was produced by Mike Nichols and Lewis Allen, and intended as a pre-Broadway tryout. It opened at the Forest Theater in Philadelphia, with Debbie Allen in the role of Alice and Marilyn Winbush back in the chorus. The show also starred Cleavant Derricks, who had come to New York to study with Vinette Carroll, and also starred Cleavant Derricks' brother, who was adopted by Vinette Carroll. But Cleavant would later win a Tony Award for his performance in Dreamgirls. The show opened on May 31st, 1978, and in a lengthy review in the Philadelphia paper, William Collins, the critic for the Inquirer, called it a flat, uninspired, and uncertain effort, a shotgun marriage of black hipness and Victorian gentility, an anemic adaptation of highly resistant classic material. As an example of what he called the staggering problems of the show, Collins cited the White Queen, dressed as a Southern belle and wrapped in a tattered Confederate flag. As a sight gag, it is perfect, but her lines have no relevance whatsoever to the racist implications of her getup. She is Lewis Carroll's White Queen, and the thematic connection to Vinette Carroll's concept is very thin. Nor was Collins alone in his assessment. The reviews were uniformly poor. Despite all this, Mike Nichols seemed to think the show would succeed. He was, after all, fairly fresh off producing a show called Annie with the same partner. But it was not to be. This show, with flashy sets and costumes, had cost nearly $1 million to mount, and $100,000 a week to run. But despite a good advance sale, the poor reviews led to a drop-off at the box office, and after 2 weeks, the total ticket sales had been only $60,000. In the second week of the run, one of the producers appealed to Philadelphia's African-American community to keep the show running. Vinette Carroll admitted that the show was not perfect, but pointed out that they expected to improve it during the projected 8 weeks of tryouts at the Forest. The run had been planned to end on July 27th, but Alice limped to a close 6 weeks early on June 11th, not quite 2 weeks after opening. It is not perhaps a high note on which to end, but one wonders if the Debbie Allen version of Vinette Carroll's Alice with its high-powered Broadway producers might have been more salvageable than the version that ended up on Broadway for a week the next year. So, because I don't want to end on a downer, I'll end by showing you some cool stuff, because who doesn't like to see cool stuff, right? David Edward Byrd comes into our story at this point. He's an American graphic artist with an Art Nouveau sensibility known for his poster designs. I didn't know it at the time, but I grew up staring at his work on the cover of the Godspell album as I listened to it over and over again as a child. But he also designed iconic posters for Stephen Sondheim's Follies, the Rolling Stones, and a little 1969 music festival called Woodstock. Byrd also designed the poster for the Broadway production of But Never Jam Today. I don't have a copy of the actual lobby card, it's hard to come by, but I do have a print of the image that David ran off for me when I bought the original artwork for the poster from him. And there's the original artwork. Would Byrd have ever gotten this commission if the show hadn't played in Philadelphia, however briefly or unsuccessfully? Who knows, but I like to think that this amazing pencil drawing is thanks in part, at least, to the city of brotherly love. So I'll leave you with my usual bit of shameless self-promotion, and despite the fact that I've told you literally everything I know about Alice in Philadelphia, if we have a minute, do we have a minute? I will be happy to take some questions. But maybe ask me about something other than Alice on stage in Philadelphia, because there's not much else I can tell you.